it started as a memoir, you know what I mean? Like Nick was based on me. And so, and my experience, you know, a lot of the early stuff is autobiographical. Then I take it in a really fictional direction. But yeah, I was started having panic attacks when I was 15, and it was like a crazy moment of just feeling everything in the world is alien. You know what I mean? Like having a body is crazy. Real simple, basic stuff became a source of this intense anxiety and uncanniness. And I wanted to write about that and about you know, what that's like when you're 15 and in the 90s, and like you're hanging out with friends at a barn who are taking acid and smoking pot and so forth. And so it started with a memoir, and then my agent Denise Shannon was like, you know, you should write this as a novel, because then you can develop it in ways. Because my own experience wasn't super interesting, you know what I mean, and in the outside, right? And um, not having to stick to that was revelatory for me, and so it enabled me to develop it in new directions. But Nick is based on my character, on me. One of the things about having panic attacks at that age, at that time in the 90s, when there wasn't as much knowledge about mental health and psychology and stuff, is I had no idea what was going on, and so for Nick, and one symptom, this is autobiographical. The symptom I had with these panic attacks was this feeling, all of a sudden, that my body would be the thing. You know what I mean? Like, and of course our bodies are things. We know that they're objects in the world, but it just suddenly struck me as really wrong that my body was this thing, and there was a sense that the part of me that was thinking and seeing and feeling was somehow not really connected to this thing of a body, and furthermore might even exit the body. Like there was this feeling of imminence, as if I could, and it was always like I would like have the feeling that I might leave my body through my eyes at what I was looking at. So that's a really unsettling and weird and strange kind of experience. And no wonder that it makes you feel like you're going crazy when you have it. You know what I mean? Um, but in the novel, I wanted to capture um, how, because the thing about panic is it's not like schizophrenia or like hallucinations, because what you're noticing when you're in a high state of anxiety isn't unreal, it's real. It is true that we have a body. It is true that no one understands. Neuroscience has no idea of how our mind, our consciousness is related to our physical brain, right? Um, so there are these real kinds of aspects of the human situation that are uncanny and strange. And throughout history, one way that people have had for making sense of these kinds of questions is religion. And so I almost wanted to show in this high school setting the birth of something like religious consciousness or religious experience. And so Nick is and his girlfriend are reading about panic in the encyclopedia, and they get the etymology of the word panic, which is from the Greek god Pan, which means apparently the Greek god Pan was thought to have, when he laughed, this panic laugh that would cause terror in everyone from his laugh, which I thought was awesome. And so then they read that in the story, and then they sort of start toying with the idea that this feeling Nick has of something weird in him that could leave his body is not part of his body necessarily. That maybe a way of thinking about that is in terms of this Greek god Pan and possession. And they sort of play around with that. And at certain points, he comes to believe that more and more as a way of making sense of his situation. And it creates this kind of like weird cult like environment with his friends. And for me, at least, especially in the 90s, smoking pot with your friends in a barn, those social situations are always on the verge of turning into a cult. You know what I mean? And so I just wanted to push it a little further and bring that aspect out. It was really interesting going back into those high school years. And a lot of those characters are based on folks I knew, you know what I mean? And you know, it was, and one thing I write about in the book is I had this sort of thought when I was looking back, getting material for the novel and thinking about my own high school experience and so forth. But you have, at least for me, and I think other people feel this too, you never again have as strong a sense of social hierarchy as you do in high school. You know what I mean? And so there was this sense, and it was really interesting because my closest friends and I, there was this kind of high school hierarchy, and we had friends with like cool kids and who were part of that group, and so I thought a lot about what made someone cool when they were when you're 15 or 16, and part of it was this trick that some kids had, and which I really admired, of seeming like they totally genuinely didn't care what you thought. You know what I mean? Like, and which is so unusual among high school, where most kids, like myself for sure, are super self-conscious, super anxious, and so forth. But there were some kids who just were like super, just didn't care. And it's funny. I wrote in the book. There's this kid who performs, and this is true. This is a true thing that happened in high school. I don't know how it happened, but he just got up in front of the whole high school and performed this dance to the song "Staying Alive" by the Bee Gees, and it was wild. And we were all sitting there, and I was looking at, and I knew the guy, and we were all sitting there looking at him. And at first, I was like, everyone's gonna kill him for this. This is so like dorky or whatever. But then within a couple seconds, he just was like so doing it and like not caring what people thought that it just turned out being the coolest thing ever. And I actually got an email from the actual guy who did that after he read the book after it came out, and he was like, "Whoa, that was me, man." um, anyway, there's a social hierarchy in high school, but then there were the ultimate cool kids, and this is again based on my own experience, who were so cool they were outside of the hierarchy in the sense that they didn't hang out with anyone in high school. They didn't talk to anyone in high school, but you knew they were hanging out with like college kids, and the actual people who this was based on, they were. It sounds like it was maybe more like your experience in D.C., which was very unusual for us in the far suburbs of Chicago. But they had friends who were like coke dealers and club goers and house producers in the city of Chicago, and they would hang out there. And to me, that was just like that's just like a whole. It was a whole different level. So we finally got to be friends with them, and me and my other best friend, the guy named whose name in the novel is Ty. And when we started hanging out with them, it was really like going into this other world, and that they had these two brothers had on their property this barn which they had taken the loft of the barn and turned it into this like magical place. It was like covered with tie dye. They had a really good sound system. I mean, they even had like a little fridge with like beer in there and shit like that. It was crazy, and so part of what I wanted to do was to memorialize that space. And I feel like lots of people when you're growing up in high school or whatever, there's some kind of space that you'll go to and that you remember as offering a kind of space outside the ordinary social world, the ordinary high school world, the ordinary adult supervised world. Um, and it's funny because I don't think that's necessarily as true today for kids because of social media and phones. Like, I've had a younger people email me about this book and say, that sounds so cool. I could never do that. My mom makes me carry around my smartphone at all times so she can keep track of me. And you just talked about your own experience. Man, in the 90s, would be like the very last thing we would allow or want. It would just destroy the whole thing. So I think that um, that was a kind of precious place, like those kinds of places, had a power to them. You know what I mean? That I wanted to write about. It was a lot of fun writing about that. It's crazy what it's done to, and people are thinking about this more now, but it really has transformed adolescence. Like, what would my life have been like if my parents were always able to know exactly where I was, if my conversations with my friends were sort of trackable on like social media or whatever, text or whatever. Um, my parents had my phone's password and all this stuff. On the one hand, I wouldn't have gotten a lot of the trouble that I did get in. But on the other hand, I just think it would have been a different. I would have been a different person. You know what I mean? For better or for worse, but it would have been different.